Picture this. It is February 1869, and the cold air of London seeps even into the sacred walls of Westminster Abbey. Torches sputter and smoke, their light spilling across ribbed arches that have seen 8 centuries of kings and queens crowned, married, and buried. Yet this night, the Abbey does not host a coronation or a wedding, but something far less ceremonial. Pickaxes ring against stone, iron strikes echoing like the tolling of distant bells. Workmen, their breath fogging in the chill, crouch over a freshly opened gap in the marble floor. The air they release is heavy, foul, ancient, an atmosphere bottled for centuries, carrying the sweet, sickly stench of death. Dean Arthur Stanley stands above them, papers clutched tight in his gloved hands. He is no ordinary clergyman. Stanley is a scholar, an explorer of the Abbey's hidden past, armed with a historian's precision and an adventurer's restlessness. In his bundle are maps, architectural drawings, burial records, documents that should reveal the resting places of England's most exalted dead. Yet the records contradict each other maddeningly. According to one, King James lies here. According to another, he lies elsewhere. Somewhere beneath these slabs is the lost tomb of the king who united the crowns of England and Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. But Stanley knows that in the Abbey, nothing is ever as tidy as a ledger line. For centuries, monarchs were interred with pomp, yet also with expedience, their bodies shuttled into vaults that were already crowded, stacked like ledgers in an accountant's cabinet. In death, as in life, politics intruded. Burials were rearranged to flatter dynasties, to erase enemies, or simply to make space. The Abbey, to Victorian eyes, is not just a church, but a palimpsest, a layered text written and rewritten by centuries of power. Stanley peers down into the opening, his face pale in the torchlight. He knows the risks. Lead coffins were meant to preserve, to seal away corruption, but they also trapped it. Once breached, a vault could release horrors, the collapse of coffins into black sludge, the shattering of brittle bones, even, if whispered accounts are to be believed, the violent explosion of a corpse swollen with gases. The Abbey is no stranger to such grotesqueries, yet the urge to know, to catalog, to reclaim lost knowledge is stronger than fear. In that moment, the scene resembles less a religious act than an archaeological dig, a Victorian obsession with unearthing the past. The same empire that scoured Egypt for mummies and Mesopotamia for clay tablets now turns inward, into the very crypt of English monarchy. What lies below may be treasure or terror or both, and so begins this dark story, not of triumphs and battles, but of what happens after the crown is lifted from the head, after the mourners disperse, after the tomb is sealed. For beneath the Abbey's stone floors lies a kingdom of the dead where power decays, where bodies are pressed together in grotesque companionship, and where the truth of royal dignity is undone by the chemistry of rot. Stanley cannot yet know it, but the search for James will lead to revelations that go far beyond the king himself. It will uncover graffiti scratched into coffins, effigies painted in false colors, and corpses turned into relics or curiosities for profit. It will force the Victorians and us to confront a disturbing question. How much respect have we ever really shown our kings and queens once the final breath leaves their body? Before we descend fully into that underworld, let us step back 3 centuries to the reign of a monarch whose death set many of these events in motion. It is March 1603. At Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, clings to life. The most powerful woman in Europe, conqueror of the Spanish Armada, is about to learn that even queens cannot bargain with death. It is the last spring of Elizabeth I's long reign, March 1603. In the chambers of Richmond Palace, the Queen sits upon cushions laid upon the floor, refusing the bed. Her courtiers beg her to lie down, but she will not. For days she has stood or sat, sleepless, wordless, her finger gnawed raw by her own teeth. The great Virgin Queen, who defied popes, who stared down the Armada, now faces the one enemy she cannot outwit, her own body, exhausted by 70 years of life and 45 years of rule. Doctors hover impotent. They bleed her, they prescribe broths and cordials, but Elizabeth refuses food, refuses rest. Her face, once famed for its painted mask of white and red, is now a skull beneath waxen skin. Her courtiers whisper that she sees ghosts, her executed cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, her loyal Robert Dudley, the countless suitors she never wed. Whether real or imagined, the visions haunt her, and she mutters that she is tied with an iron collar of torment. At last, she collapses. They carry her to bed, where she lingers in silence. When asked to name her successor, she makes only a gesture, lifting her thin hand towards Scotland. The meaning is clear enough. James, son of Mary Stuart, will inherit the throne. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth dies. The Tudor dynasty ends. The crown passes to the Stuarts, and with it begins a new story of burials, of vaults, of kings and queens crammed into the abbey until even the dead begin to lose their place. Her funeral procession is one of the grandest England has ever seen. For 3 miles through the streets of London, thousands line the way. Church bells toll, drums roll, banners droop in the gray sky. Atop her coffin lies a wooden effigy of Elizabeth, painted to resemble her in life, stiff white ruff, golden crown, scepter in hand. The effigy nods with each jolt of the carriage, giving the eerie impression that the dead queen herself still surveys her subjects. When the coffin reaches Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth is interred in Henry Roman VII Chapel, a place already thick with royal bones. For now her tomb is fitting, a monument of marble and alabaster, her effigy carved in eternal rest. But this dignity will not last. A century later, her grave will be disturbed to make space for another queen. And Elizabeth, the monarch who commanded an empire, will be reduced to a tenant, her bones mingled with those of her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. 2 queens bound in life by rivalry, bound in death by convenience. It is this uneasy mingling, this quiet erasure, that Dean Stanley will confront 260 years later when he opens the Abbey's vaults. For here the past does not sleep peacefully. It jostles, it shifts, it resurfaces in ways both grotesque and unforgettable. But before we rejoin Stanley in his midnight search, we must turn to James, the king whose coffin he seeks. For if Elizabeth refused to lie down, James was a man who never truly fit in the Abbey, alive or dead. The Abbey breathes differently with James' eye. He is the king who inherits Elizabeth's crown, yet never her majesty. James is awkward in body and mind, a man more comfortable with books and hunting dogs than with pageantry. When he enters London in 1604, the people expect a second Elizabeth, sharp, commanding, glittering. Instead, they see a nervous Scotsman with a rolling gait, a tongue too loose for diplomacy, a body that twitches with restless energy. Still, James is no small figure. He unites 2 crowns, England and Scotland, into one kingdom, however uneasy. He survives the gunpowder plot, commissions the King James Bible, and fills his court with philosophers, artists, and masks. Yet his reign is shadowed by suspicion, scandal, and the constant whisper that he is foreign, not truly English. James's body tells its own story. He is plagued by gout, by arthritis, by a digestive system as troubled as his politics. His courtiers write of his strange habits, fingernails gnawed to the quick, tongue that lolls, clothes always padded against imagined assassins. He fears steel, hates swords, surrounds himself with guards even in private. He is a king who rules by intellect and paranoia rather than presence. When James dies in 1625, he leaves behind a kingdom uneasy, a dynasty uncertain. His funeral is grand, but beneath the pomp lies discomfort. For Elizabeth had been England's body incarnate, a queen who stood as symbol as much as sovereign. James is something else. His corpse does not rest easily among the Tudors and Plantagenets. He is buried in Henry Roman VII Chapel, placed within the vaults that will, centuries later, so fascinate Dean Stanley. And yet James does not remain undisturbed. The abbey becomes crowded, overrun by generations of monarchs. Graves are dug, bones shifted, vaults reused. By the 18th century, when Stanley prowls the crypts with his lantern, James's coffin will be hidden behind layers of wood and lead. his effigy long gone, his memory overshadowed by Elizabeth's glow. But James leaves a ghost that lingers. The whispers of his mannerisms, his uneasy rein, his peculiar body, all haunt the abbey. And when the coffins are opened, when Stanley pulls away the dust and finds the king's remains, the oddness of James will seem almost preserved, etched into bone and cloth. For this is what the abbey teaches, that greatness and awkwardness alike collapse into the same darkness, into vaults that remember even when nations forget. And yet, if James rests uneasily, what of those who followed? His son Charles, whose very body would be torn apart by his subjects, whose burial would be more secret than sovereign. The abbey has never known silence like that of January 30, 1649. On that morning, King Charles I walks from Whitehall to a scaffold built before the banqueting house. The snow crunches under his boots, the air sharp with frost. He wears 2 shirts, fearing that if he shivered in the cold, his enemies might mistake it for fear. The crowd waits in tense silence. For years, England has torn itself apart in civil war, parliament against crown, brother against brother, church against church. Charles, son of James I, has become the symbol of tyranny, accused of ruling without parliament, of crushing liberties, of raising taxes and armies against his own people. Now he stands condemned by his subjects, a king brought low by the very laws he was meant to embody. On the scaffold, he speaks with quiet dignity. He insists he is the King of England, the lawful king. He forgives those who condemn him, entrusting his soul to God. Then he lays his neck upon the block. At a signal, the axe falls in one clean stroke. A groan rises from the crowd, followed by an eerie stillness. The king's severed head is held aloft for all to see. Behold the head of a traitor. England has killed its king, and with that act the monarchy itself seems buried. But the abbey waits, for though Charles is not immediately interred in its vaults, he is not forgotten. His body is carried in secret to Windsor, buried hastily in St. George's Chapel without crown, without monument, without ceremony. He becomes a king hidden, a sovereign denied the pageantry of death. Yet the memory of his execution burns brighter for its secrecy. When monarchy is restored in 1660 under Charles Roman II, the cult of the martyred king begins. Charles I is painted as a saintly figure, his death reimagined as sacrifice. His severed head becomes a relic of loyalty, his execution a cautionary tale of rebellion. By the 18th century, poets will write of him as a Christ-like figure, dying for the sins of his people. And so, when Dean Stanley later lifts the lids of coffins and uncovers bones, it is this question that lingers. What happens when a king dies not in majesty, but in violence? When the crown is cut not from his brow, but from his very body? The abbey, overcrowded with rulers, cannot escape the shadow of that severed head. Charles does not lie there, but his absence is felt more keenly than many who do. And with Charles gone, the story shifts again to his son, Charles Roman II, a man who sought to restore the monarchy's glamour, yet found his own death just as entangled in the abbey's cramped and unsettling vaults. Charles Roman II is remembered for his laughter, his mistresses, his restoration court filled with wit, music, and theatrical splendor. If his father's reign ended on the scaffold, Charles's life was a constant performance, a masquerade to distract from the scars of civil war. Londoners adored him, at least at first, for reopening theaters, for filling the city with pageantry, for being a king who seemed almost human, almost one of them. But the abbey does not care for the merriment of life. It waits for the stillness of death. In 1685, Charles suffers a sudden seizure. For days, doctors bleed him, purge him, force strange concoctions down his throat, powdered pearls, liquefied herbs, even a draught of pulverized human skull, thought to carry healing force. None of it saves him. The merry monarch lies still at last, his body swollen, his once lively eyes dimmed. His funeral, though grand, carries a strange air of improvisation. Unlike Elizabeth or James, Charles leaves no carefully planned monument, no clear place of rest. He is carried into Westminster Abbey and lowered into the same vault as his grandfather James I. a vault already crowded, already straining under the weight of royal remains. When the coffin is sealed, it rests among neighbors both uneasy and unchosen. And in time, when Dean Stanley pries open these vaults in the 19th century, he will find Charles's coffin wedged awkwardly beside others, its inscription half effaced, its monarch reduced to anonymity. Yet Charles Roman II leaves behind something more haunting than his coffin. He leaves the memory of a monarchy remade not by glory, but by survival. The line of kings continues, but each burial tells the same quiet truth, that death strips away crowns and costumes alike. The abbey receives them not as rulers, but as bones laid out in silence. Still, Charles is not the only monarch to end in awkward fashion. His brother James Roman II will die in exile, his body never finding rest in the abbey. And soon, the vaults of Westminster will overflow with so many coffins that kings and queens alike are shuffled like chess pieces in the dark. For in the centuries to come, the abbey ceases to be a solemn resting place, and instead becomes a warehouse of the dead, where majesty and neglect sleep side by side. The abbey's vaults by the 18th century are no longer orderly. They are crowded, improvised, more like a boarding house for monarchs than a palace of eternal rest. The bones of kings and queens lie cheek by jowl, the neat hierarchy of power dissolved in the dark. Not all monarchs even make it here. James Roman II, brother of Charles Roman II, dies in exile in France after being deposed in the Glorious Revolution. His Catholic body is denied the abbey's Protestant ground. For years, his remains wander, first at Saint-Germain, later disturbed during the French Revolution, scattered and desecrated. His heart, preserved separately, travels across Europe, a relic without a shrine. In the abbey, there is no vault for him. The English crown he once wore rests instead on the heads of his usurpers. Others find themselves buried here not by choice, but by necessity. The abbey becomes a kind of royal catch-all, accommodating those for whom no grand plan had been made. Children of kings, queens consort, distant relations, all are pressed into its vaults. The abbey grows overcrowded, and each new burial requires shifting the old, moving coffins, disturbing the dust of centuries. By the reign of George Roman II in the mid-18th century, the practice reaches a strange intensity. George insists on being buried beside his beloved queen, Caroline of Ansbach. He demands his coffin be placed so close that, when the lead decays, their dust might mingle. A tender gesture, but one that requires more shuffling in an already overstuffed vault. When Dean Stanley later descends with his lantern, he finds not neat rows but a chaos of coffins, some stacked upon others, some crumbling, their inscriptions lost. A jumble of sovereigns, once mighty, now indistinguishable. What strikes him most is not reverence but neglect. The abbey's guardians had long treated it as a museum rather than a sanctuary. Coffins were open to satisfy curiosity, bodies exposed to visiting nobles, even relics removed as souvenirs. Royalty, once the most guarded of human beings, became spectacles in death. And it is within this disarray that Stanley seeks the coffin of James I, a king awkward in life and even more misplaced in death. To reach him, he must pass by the remains of Charles Roman II, of Queen's consort, of long-dead princes. He must sort through the crowded dead. But before he finds James, he encounters something stranger still. The skull of a king who should not be there at all. A relic of violence preserved within the abbey's walls, the head of Charles I. When Dean Arthur Stanley lowers his lantern in the abbey's vaults, what he finds is not only coffins, but fragments, relics, echoes of violence. Among them lies the most startling discovery of all, the head of Charles I. For 2 centuries after his execution, Charles's body had lain in obscurity at Windsor, buried hastily by loyalists who feared further desecration. Yet secrecy bred rumor. Whispers spread that his head was separated from his body, that it had been carried off as a relic or hidden within the abbey. Some claimed to have seen it, others dismissed it as fantasy. But in 1813, during work at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, his coffin was opened. Inside lay the body intact, except for the neck, where the severed head rested, detached yet preserved. The skin still clung to the bone, the beard unmistakably that of the martyred king. Witnesses noted the features with eerie precision, as though death had not erased, but rather etched them more deeply. Stanley, chronicling these accounts decades later, understands the power of such a sight. The head of Charles I is not merely a relic, but a symbol, proof that kings can be undone, that crowns may be cut away with a single stroke. In the abbey where monarchs lie in pomp, the memory of that severed head lingers like a ghost. It is a reminder that even here in this supposed sanctuary, the violence of history seeps through the stones. For the abbey is not only a tomb, it is a theater. Coffins are opened, corpses examined, bones rearranged. Visitors come to peer at the remains of greatness, as if even in death, kings and queens must perform. Charles's head, gazed upon by doctors and courtiers alike, becomes part of that performance. And yet the spectacle unsettles. To look upon the head of a beheaded king is to confront the fragility of monarchy itself. The body politic, that grand fiction of unbroken power, collapses into flesh and bone. Vulnerable to the axe, Stanley writes with reverence but also unease. He cannot forget that the abbey, so full of ceremony above ground, is chaotic below. That coffins lie shattered, bones exposed, royalty mingled with dust. And within that mingling, the head of Charles I stares back, silent but eloquent, a witness to the violent birth of modern England. Still, even this grisly relic is not the most haunting discovery. For as Stanley searches deeper, he finds not only scattered remains, but entire coffins crammed together, their royal occupants long forgotten, their names half erased. And it is there, in that jumbled company, that he uncovers the uneasy afterlife of Elizabeth I and her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. Beneath the marble grandeur of Henry VII Chapel, Dean Stanley's lantern reveals a sight so grotesque it borders on parody. The coffins of Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, stacked one upon the other like luggage in a storeroom. Elizabeth, glorious, imperious, the virgin queen who had defied kings and popes alike, rests above. Her coffin is massive, its lead shell molded into the outline of her body, as if the shape of her power could be preserved in metal. Below, pressed into the flagstones by centuries of weight, lies Mary, her Catholic cousin, rival, and victim. In life, the two women had been enemies. Elizabeth, the Protestant monarch who executed Mary after years of imprisonment. Mary, the Catholic claimant whose existence haunted Elizabeth's reign like a specter. One sister of destiny, one sister of doom. And yet here in the cold vault of the abbey, they are closer than they had ever been in life. Elizabeth's coffin crushing down on Mary's bones, an eternal act of dominance. The symbolism is almost too sharp to be coincidence. James I, Mary's son and Elizabeth's heir, had ordered the arrangement himself. Publicly, he spoke of reconciliation, commissioning a white marble monument that honored Elizabeth's reign. But beneath the stone, his choice told another story. He may have reburied Mary with ceremony at Westminster, but he ensured she would never rise above Elizabeth. The Protestant queen forever on top, the Catholic queen forever beneath. Stanley records the details clinically. The tarnished lead, the graffiti scrawled across Elizabeth's coffin, the Tudor rose etched into the metal. But one can almost hear his unspoken thoughts. This is no peaceful resting place, no shared grave of sisters in Christ. This is a grotesque parody of kinship, a forced intimacy imposed by politics. And the atmosphere of the vault only sharpens the horror. The stench of centuries still lingers, faint but unmistakable. The air is thick, stale, heavy with the knowledge that these coffins, sealed in lead, are not inert monuments but pressure chambers of rot. Southwell's old story comes to mind, the tale of Elizabeth's corpse swelling with noxious vapors until it burst. Superstition, perhaps, but here, looking at the lead bulging around Elizabeth's outline, one wonders. Above ground, Elizabeth's effigy lies in splendor, marble robes flowing, crown gleaming. Below, the reality is lead dust, and the crushing of one queen upon another. Stanley must have felt it in that moment, the dissonance between the Abbey's sanctity and the vault's grotesquerie, between the myth of monarchy and the biology of death, between the Virgin Queen's eternal glory and the simple fact of her decaying weight pressing down on her enemy. Two queens, one tomb, a double-decker coffin of rivalry and rot, the ultimate reminder that history does not end at death. It festers, mingles, and corrodes, just like the lead coffins below Westminster Abbey. Dean Stanley and his men stood at the edge of the vault, lanterns trembling in their hands, and though the reports never said it plainly, one detail must have struck them first: the smell. Not overwhelming, perhaps, not enough to drive them from the chamber, but an unmistakable trace of corruption carried in the stagnant air. The stench of royalty, preserved and concentrated for centuries, escaping now into the living world. Elizabeth Southwell, the Queen's attendant in her final days, had written of Elizabeth's corpse swelling with noxious vapors until it burst within the coffin. Victorian historians dismissed her as unreliable, a woman weaving fables from grief. Yet standing before those heavy lead boxes, Stanley might have wondered, was it truly fantasy? For a sealed coffin of lead is no sanctuary, it is a cauldron. Inside, decay follows its own chemistry. Flesh and bone break down, releasing methane, hydrogen, sulfide, ammonia. In a wooden coffin, these gases leak slowly into the earth, but in lead, thick and unyielding, there is no escape. Pressure builds. The coffin becomes a grotesque alchemical vessel, distilling royal flesh into liquid and gas, until the seams strain, until the metal itself begins to bulge with the memory of a body that no longer exists. There are other accounts, whispered but recorded, that give weight to this horror. When Edward Ives' vault was opened at Windsor, the attendants found his bones submerged in 3 inches of blackened liquid, the residue of putrefaction, mixed with the dissolved coffin wood. A royal broth, centuries in the making. When other vaults were disturbed, the same pattern appeared. The grotesque mingling of liquefied flesh, bone, and clothing, transformed into foul pools at the bottom of lead-lined coffins. One imagines Elizabeth's coffin in such a state. Heavy as stone, its lead walls sweating with corrosion, the effigy above her tomb singing of eternal glory, while below, chemical forces worked with cruel patience, and pressing down beneath it Mary's coffin, the rival queen, literally crushed beneath not just Elizabeth's weight, but centuries of her putrid remains, dripping slowly downward, seeping into the wood and bones below. Victorian sensibilities forbade Stanley from describing such horrors outright. His words remain measured, scholarly, cautious. But between the lines, the truth lingers. He notes the coffins, distinctly shaped in the form of the body. What did that mean? That the lead had collapsed around Elizabeth's corpse, preserving its silhouette? That the gases had forced the coffin into an unnatural contortion? The phrasing is clinical, but behind it pulses a visceral image. The outline of a woman preserved not in marble or canvas, but in a coffin swollen with rot. Here is the real dissonance. Above, in the Abbey's hushed nave, choirs sing of resurrection, marble effigies glisten in candlelight. Tourists shuffle reverently past monuments to kings and queens. But below, in the silence of the vault, lies the unvarnished truth. Power rots. Glory decays. Even monarchs ferment, their bodies reduced to gases and foul liquids, their coffins holding in what dignity the earth refuses to allow. The stench of royalty is more than a physical odor. It is a metaphor for the monarchy itself. A perfume of sanctity above ground, but a reek of corruption beneath. Stanley, with his torch and his notes, may not have written it so bluntly, but he must have felt it, as every intruder of that vault surely did. That death is democratic, that no crown, no lead, no marble can stop the slow, inexorable chemistry of decay. The vault beneath Westminster was not an isolated horror. It was only one chapter in a long, unsettling chronicle of how Britain treated its royal dead, not as sacred relics to be protected, but as commodities, curiosities, even playthings for the living. Stanley's discoveries fit into a broader pattern. Kings and queens, even in death, were never allowed to rest. Their remains were pried open, plundered, displayed, or reduced to curios for collectors. The sanctity of a royal corpse was a fiction, eroded whenever curiosity or profit called. Take Edward the Confessor. When Henry Roman II opened his coffin in 1163, the king's body was found almost perfectly preserved, still clad in cloth of gold, a pilgrim's ring glinting on his finger. Did Henry kneel in awe? No. He stripped the saint king of his treasures, turning the golden cloth into ecclesiastical robes and keeping the ring as a relic for himself. Or consider Duke Humphrey of Gloucester. Entombed at St. Albans, his embalming fluid was believed by women to be a miracle cure for wrinkles. Monks and opportunists sold thimbles of it to visitors, turning his corpse into a grotesque beauty industry. When the fluid ran out, scavengers took his hair, his nails, even fragments of bone until only a husk remained. The Duke's body, once a statesman's, became a marketplace of charms and superstitions. Nor were queens spared indignity. Catherine de Valois, wife of Henry V, suffered perhaps the most lurid fate. For centuries, her coffin was displayed to paying visitors in Westminster Abbey itself. Imagine it. Tourists filing past, a few coins exchanged, and a queen's remains unveiled as macabre entertainment. Some even touched her body for luck, a grotesque parody of pilgrimage. The practice reached into modern centuries too. In 1784, when Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry Roman VII, was disturbed at Bury St. Edmunds, her coffin was pried open. Inside, her golden hair spilled out, still radiant after 200 years. A marvel to some, but her beauty did not remain her own. Locks of it were snipped away, treasured as trophies, scattered into private hands. Even restoration work carried this casual desecration. When Richard Roman II's tomb was opened in 1871, his skeleton lay nearly intact, but not for long. Workmen pocketed fragments of wood, scraps of cloth, even pieces of his glove. These relics ended up not in museums, but in a cigarette box in the basement of the National Portrait Gallery, royal remains reduced to trinkets beside tobacco. One can almost feel the bitter irony. Monarchs who had commanded armies, reshaped kingdoms, and claimed divine right were, in death, as vulnerable as paupers. Their bodies became curiosities for clerics, collectors, and tourists. The embalming fluid of a duke sold by the spoonful, a queen's hair cut like a souvenir, a king's bones shuffled into a cigarette tin. Elizabeth and Mary, stacked in their grotesque vault, were not exceptions. They were part of a tradition that revealed more about the living than the dead. Greed, superstition, and a relentless hunger to possess fragments of majesty. The tombs of Westminster may seem like monuments of eternal peace, but history whispers otherwise. Behind their stone facades lies a far darker truth, that even in death, royalty was never safe from the intrusions of the curious, the opportunistic, and the irreverent. Step into Westminster Abbey today, and you are met not with bare stone, but with brilliance. The walls blaze with color, gilded inscriptions gleam, marble effigies recline in noble repose. Here lies majesty, dignity, sanctity, or so it seems. But this splendor is, in truth, a mask. What you see is theater, a carefully staged illusion designed to hide the reality beneath. When Sir George Gilbert Scott restored the Abbey in the 19th century, he did so not to preserve truth, but to create spectacle. He cleaned, polished, repainted, turning faded monuments into glittering icons of national pride. The cracked, the broken, the despoiled, these were smoothed over, erased. A narrative of uninterrupted glory was sculpted into the very stone. Take the funeral effigies. In their day, these wax figures of kings and queens stood at the heart of ritual, dressed in robes, crowns, and jewels, paraded before the people. They were symbols of continuity. Though the monarch was gone, the body lived on in wax, radiating permanence. But strip away the robes, and the effigies are grotesque. Bulbous heads, distorted features, wax crumbling into caricature. The Abbey displays them in glass cases like relics, but what they reveal is fragility, artifice, the grotesque masquerading as immortality, or look to the painted tombs. Richard Roman II, Henry Roman VII, Elizabeth I, their effigies are lifelike, serene, eternal. Yet beneath the paint lies rot. We know from desecrations and disinterments that the bodies are shattered, bones scattered, coffins broken. The painted faces smile still, a lie in marble that reassures the living while concealing the disarray of the dead. Scott's restoration went further still. He introduced order where there had been chaos. Tombs had once been crowded, clustered, even vandalized by visitors carving initials into sacred stone. Scott rearranged them, cleared sight lines, installed velvet ropes. What had been messy, human, unsettling became museum-like, sanitized, orderly, reverent. This was not preservation, it was invention. A reimagining of Westminster not as a place of disturbance and desecration, but as a temple of glory. A lie painted over stone and wax, polished until it gleamed. Yet the lie is fragile. A whisper of history undoes it. We know the coffins were opened, the bones disturbed, the relics scattered. We know the Abbey was not always silent, but once rang with the sounds of chisels, saws, tourists, and thieves. The Abbey presents us with grandeur. But the truth, the vaults, the relics, the desecrations, lurks just beneath, waiting to be remembered. Westminster Abbey is not only a tomb, it is a stage. Every coronation, every royal wedding, every state funeral plays out here as a ritual drama, with the living walking in the footsteps of the dead. From the moment William the Conqueror was crowned within its walls in 1066, the Abbey became fused with monarchy itself. The coronation ritual is a pageant designed to overwhelm. Trumpets blare, choirs soar, incense thickens the air. A monarch kneels, stripped of robes, anointed with holy oil. A moment so sacred it is shielded from the eyes of even the congregation. And then, as the choir erupts, a crown is lowered onto the head, and majesty is reborn before the eyes of the people. But this theater is also a weapon. The monarchy uses it to assert continuity, even when reality teeters on the edge of collapse. Elizabeth I's coronation painted her as God's chosen ruler in a time of religious division. James I's insisted on legitimacy, for a Scottish king ruling England for the first time. Even in our own time, the coronation of Elizabeth Roman II in 1953 was broadcast to millions, a spectacle designed to cement loyalty in an age of empire's collapse. The Abbey amplifies these performances. Its soaring Gothic arches make mortals seem small. Its tombs remind rulers of their lineage. Every step in the ritual passes by monuments to the dead, an implicit warning that the crown is borrowed, not owned. And yet, by tying monarchy to sacred stone, the ceremony convinces both ruler and ruled that kingship is eternal, sanctioned by God, woven into the very fabric of the nation. But theater cuts both ways. The Abbey has also staged defiance. During Charles Roman II coronation, dissenters spread pamphlets mocking the pomp. At James Roman II, whispers of Catholic tyranny marred the ritual. Even at Elizabeth Roman II coronation, while millions watched in awe, there were those who scoffed that the ceremony was archaic theater masking political weakness. Still, the stage endures. Every funeral, too, is a performance. The coffin draped in velvet, the slow toll of bells, the body carried past ancient tombs. Here, grief is choreographed as national unity. A monarch's death is not the end of power, but its transformation. The Abbey ensures that even in death, the monarchy commands the stage. For more than 9 centuries, Westminster Abbey has been theater. Its rituals convince us that kings and queens are more than human, that their reign is part of an eternal story. Yet behind the spectacle lies a harsher truth. The Abbey stages grandeur not to reveal, but to conceal. Its pageantry dazzles, even as its vaults whisper the fragility of flesh and the inevitability of decay. Walk the flagstones of Westminster Abbey, and you tread upon more than history. Beneath your feet lie bones, thousands upon thousands, layered like pages in a book too long to read. Kings and queens, poets and generals, bishops and statesmen, all pressed together in the dark. The abbey may dazzle the eye with monuments and gilded arches, but its foundation is not marble. It is bone. In the 19th century, Dean Stanley pried open the vaults, seeking to catalog the royal dead. What he found was chaos. Coffins stacked haphazardly, lids splintered, names effaced, bones jumbled together without order. Some vaults so overcrowded that to insert a new coffin, others had to be shifted, broken, even cannibalized for space. Imagine it, the body of Mary, Queen of Scots, once interred in splendor, lying in a coffin gnawed by time, set beside rivals who once condemned her. The infant children of queens, tucked into corners like afterthoughts. Noblemen squeezed into niches never meant for them. This was not majesty, it was overcrowding, a grotesque compression of mortality. Even the monuments above are often lies. Tombs proclaim lineage, serenity, eternal rest. But open the ground and you find the truth: disarray, disturbance, neglect. Richard Roman II effigy smiles, yet his coffin shows signs of tampering. Henry Vitaques's gleaming monument stands proud, though his bones were scattered and reassembled with uncertainty. Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor lie together in uneasy peace, their coffins touching within the same vault, sisters in death, though their lives were defined by bitter division. And then there are the fragments, skulls without names, bones without coffins, relics misplaced when vaults were disturbed in centuries past. Some were kept as curiosities, displayed to select visitors, their origins forgotten. These are not the remains of monarchs alone, but of servants, clerics, musicians, lives that slipped quietly into the abbey's soil, now indistinguishable from royalty. This is the hidden abbey, not the grand theater of coronations or the painted lie of glory, but a charnel house, a place where the truth of mortality bursts through marble and gold. And yet there is something profoundly human here, for in this jumble of bones, distinctions collapse. Kings lie beside children. Queens share vaults with rivals. The powerful and the powerless are united in the same earth. The abbey tells us of triumphs, but its vaults tell another story. That death is the great leveler, and that even the most gilded crown cannot resist the press of time and the weight of stone. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Westminster Abbey was no longer just the burial place of kings. It had become something else, a shrine to national memory, where the story of Britain was written not in ink but in stone and bone. It was poets first. Geoffrey Chaucer, interred in 1400 almost by accident, he was buried here simply because he lived nearby, became the seed of what would grow into Poets' Corner. Around him gathered Spenser, Dryden, Johnson, Tennyson, Browning, Dickens. Their stones do not merely mark graves, they proclaim that literature, too, is part of the nation's crown. Soon soldiers joined them. Admirals and generals, Nelson and Wellington, monuments rising like cliffs among the poets. Then scientists, Newton's tomb gleaming beneath the arches, Darwin's grave laid humbly nearby, a statement that discovery could sit beside scripture in the temple of the nation. By the Victorian age, the abbey had become a pantheon, not just a church, not merely a royal mausoleum, but a theater where Britain told its story to itself. Every statue, every inscription was a chapter in the narrative of empire, faith, and progress. The abbey became a stage on which national identity was projected, polished, sanctified. And yet this too was selective memory. There are no monuments to the enslaved who labored for empire, no tombs for the countless nameless soldiers who perished in colonial wars. Memory here was curated, sculpted, chosen. To be interred in Westminster Abbey was to be canonized into the story Britain wished to tell of itself. Still, the effect is undeniable. To walk its aisles is to wander through a nation's self-image. To read names like Chaucer, Newton, Darwin, Dickens, Tennyson is to feel the pulse of a culture that sought to place art, science, and power side by side with monarchy and faith. The abbey became the national memory, not because it remembered all, but because it remembered with purpose. It chose, and in choosing, it shaped how the living would understand the dead. Even today, when new burials are rare, the Abbey continues this role. The tomb of the unknown warrior interred after the First World War is perhaps its most poignant statement. A single anonymous soldier, representing the countless who died nameless, lying in the heart of kings. Here at last was a grave that spoke not of privilege, but of loss shared by all. Westminster Abbey tells the story of power, but also of memory, crafted, contested, and incomplete. It is not only a church of the dead, but a mirror held up to the living. Step into Westminster Abbey when the crowds have gone, when the last tourist has drifted out and the echoes of footsteps fade. The silence is heavy, almost physical. You feel it pressing down from the vaulted ceiling, seeping from the stone, whispering from the tombs. In this silence, the Abbey reveals itself not as theater, nor as national shrine, but as what it has always been, a house of the dead. Everywhere the dead speak. Kings who ruled empires now lie in cracked coffins. Poets who shaped language rest in slabs worn smooth by centuries of shoes. Soldiers who fell unnamed are remembered only by a stone that refuses to carry a name. The Abbey is not a place of immortality, but of mortality made visible. And mortality here is not neat. It is not the serene effigies gazing skyward or the polished inscriptions that promise eternal glory. It is the vaults overcrowded with bones, the coffins wedged against one another, the wax effigies whose faces melt into grotesque parodies of life. It is the reminder that even kings decay, even poets rot, even empires crumble. Yet in this confrontation lies the Abbey's deepest power. It forces us to reckon with death, not as abstraction, but as certainty. The Abbey has outlasted dynasties, revolutions, wars, fires, plagues. The bodies within it have been shifted, broken, forgotten. But the lesson remains constant. Power fades, flesh fails, stone endures. And still in that endurance there is hope. For the Abbey does not merely preserve the dead, it transforms them. It gives them voice, makes their silence resonate, turns their absence into presence. The Abbey is a reminder that memory itself is stronger than flesh, that to be remembered even imperfectly is a kind of afterlife. Perhaps that is why we keep returning. To marvel at kings and poets, yes, but also to hear the whisper that one day we too will be bones beneath stone. That we too will rely on the memory of others to grant us shape in the world after we are gone. In the end, Westminster Abbey is not about death alone. It is about the living learning to face death and to carry its weight with dignity. Westminster Abbey stands today as it has for nearly 1,000 years. A place where kings are crowned, poets remembered, warriors honored, and the dead laid to rest. But beneath the grandeur and the rituals, the Abbey whispers a truth far older and far simpler than the monuments that adorn it. It is this: all power is temporary. The Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, all came here robed in majesty, certain of their permanence. All now lie in vaults crowded with bones, their crowns rusted, their names half forgotten. The Abbey reminds us that even the most glittering reign ends in silence. And yet it also tells us that memory endures. Not as fact, too many bones are jumbled, too many monuments lie, but as story. For the Abbey is not just a tomb, it is a storyteller. It chooses what to display, what to polish, what to conceal. It tells us of glory where there was chaos, of dignity where there was decay. It teaches us not only how England has remembered its dead, but how it has chosen to remember itself. Perhaps that is the Abbey's final lesson, that history is always theater. That the monuments, the pageantry, even the silence are part of a performance meant to shape how we see the past. Beneath it all, the bones tell their own truth, a truth of fragility, of finality, of humanity. To walk through the Abbey is to step into that paradox. It is to see splendor and to know it is illusion. It is to admire marble kings and waxen queens, while hearing the faint whisper of coffins splitting in the dark below. It is to stand before the tomb of the unknown warrior and feel, perhaps for the first time, that all the Abbey's centuries of grandeur exist to frame a single, undeniable reality. That life is brief, and death is shared. When you leave the Abbey, stepping back into the noise of London, you carry something of that silence with you. The Abbey does not release its visitors unchanged. It places upon you the same burden it has placed on kings and commoners alike. The knowledge that you too will one day be a story told by others, a name carved or forgotten, a silence folded into the earth. Westminster Abbey's stones endure, but not to console. They endure to remind, and in that reminder lies its strange, haunting gift.